Because the only two times you've ever called me are when you were in Afghanistan and Ukraine.
Well, I mean, who can say that their friend called them from Kabul?
How about the Taliban?
The Taliban. Well, towards tourists, they're fine because they kind of want to boost the image of Afghanistan.
Because where were you? Turkmenistan, Tajikistan? And you're like, oh, I can just get a visa on arrival?
Oh, yes. I was traveling Central Asia all the way from Kazakhstan to Tajikistan. And apparently, that's the only border in the world where you can actually get a visa on arrival for Afghanistan. And I was tempted. I was like, yeah, why not? It's a bit expensive, to be honest.
You always seem to be able to do trips at a budget I didn't even think was possible.
Well, you've got to consider that in Europe we have budget airlines, so you can fly literally anywhere for a couple of bucks. I know
what was your cheapest that you got to Ireland or something, wasn't it?
No, it was to Kuwait from Abu Dhabi. It was €9. Yeah, there's some very cheap airlines like Wizz Air or Ryanair
that's cheaper than lunch.
For example, Switzerland or Norway, they're not budget friendly at all. Like, just check for cheaper countries, especially in Europe. I can recommend the Balkan region, Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Beautiful countries, super cheap. For example, I flew to Bosnia and Herzegovina for €40 return. So if you want to travel by yourself, sure, it works. You can do couch surfing, you can get like a cheap apartment, a hostel room, whatever. But if you travel with friends, you kind of have the luxury to share a room. So I always use Booking.com or Airbnb.
Yeah, but that's why my Tasmania trip was so absurdly expensive, because I'm renting a car by myself, staying in places that could sleep 4 people, but by myself.
Exactly.
Or if you had those other 4 people.
Yeah, we stayed at one Airbnb in Tuzla in the north of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it was $20 a night.
Wow.
But we were 4 people, so it was $5 a night per person.
Jeez.
So yeah, when people ask me, why can't you travel so much? You must be rich. No, it's actually not. I mean, there are people spending hundreds of euros on concert tickets or
whatever, don't look at me like
new
that.
Sneakers.
What? So where do you think you went to budget? You're like, I regret going this cheap.
So we took a shared taxi from Joburg to Lesotho, a small landlocked country within South Africa. The shared taxi was just so full. It was probably meant to be for like 12 people. They put like 20 in there with luggage, totally overloaded. And yeah, that was one of these moments where I was like, nah, I could have just flown there, but a flight would have been $100+ and the taxi was, I don't remember, like 17 maybe.
Well, we did a bit of that last night. Well, you were chilling in the front seat. I was squashed up in the back and so many people in the car.
Sorry. I just recently went to Russia in February of this year, and I went to Ukraine last year during the war. Obviously, I had a Ukrainian stamp in my passport, and I was stupid enough to not take my other passport. Like, I went to the border officer, she looked at my passport, she had a magnifying glass, just went through every passport. Then she saw my Ukraine stamp, and she was like, Ukraine? I was like, fuck. Then she handed my passport to her colleague, and he took me into an interrogation room, and he interrogated me for like 1 hour. So there was one guy watching us, one guy just asking me the questions, and one guy translating with his phone.
Are you a spy?
Yes, exactly. They ask these kind of questions like, are you a spy, or what are your plans in Russia? What have you done in Ukraine? Where have you been in Ukraine? They want to know if you actually know what you're talking about. Because if you show up and you're like, yeah, I want to go to St. Petersburg, and they ask you like, what do you want to see there, and you don't have a clue.
But isn't that how most of us travel? Like, I'm going to Berlin tomorrow, and if someone asks me, what do you want to do there? I'm like, I guess see some war stuff? I've got no details on, like, everything's so last minute.
Like, every time I go to a place, I prepare myself. Like, I look up what sites there are and stuff, so I don't waste time while being there.
That's true.
Looking up stuff.
Because if you're only going around for a couple of days, you don't want that to be... Were you saying you had 2 passports? I didn't even know that was a thing until a few weeks ago.
Well, in certain countries it's possible. Germany is one of them. If you have, for example, a stamp from a certain country, then other countries might deny you entry.
It's where I first heard of it. Athletes will get it because if they're traveling so much, like F1 drivers or touring around the world, by the time you send off your passport for visas, you need the passport to get into another country.
Exactly,
So you need both.
That's also a valid reason. So I went to my 56th country back then, which was Jordan, and across the land border to Israel, and I got this stamp. Israel didn't stamp, Jordan did.
Yeah.
But all Arab countries know this border.
Yeah.
Because they're like, oh yeah, you know, this is the border with Israel, so you must have been to Israel, obviously.
Yeah.
So I had to get a new passport to go to certain countries afterwards. It's kind of fun because you just want to travel. You're not there to promote war or political ideologies or whatever. Like you
shouldn't stop a tourist.
Exactly.
Because it's like the US, they're very clear. Have you been to one of these like 6 countries? And if you have, you'll get flagged when you arrive, and they'll probably bring you into that back room because you haven't been to the US since.
Exactly,
You've done this loop around
because I'm kind of blacklisted now. Problem is that for Europeans, there's the ESTA.
Yeah.
But the problem is you can't get this travel authorization if you've been to, what are the countries, like Syria, Iraq.
Yeah, there's a couple
North
in there that
Korea,
they've flagged. Yep.
Cuba, I think they just added. They removed Afghanistan, which is weird. But
Take it, I guess.
Well, yeah. My problem is I went to Iraq.
Yep. They're not going to like that. They're not going to like Russia either. They're not going to like...
Oh, no, Russia's fine.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah,
Well, it's like the New Zealander who went to... It's like Turkmenistan or Tajikistan, one of those countries. And they weren't allowed in. They got stopped at the border because they're like, New Zealand doesn't exist. And like, what do you mean New Zealand doesn't exist? Like, see, it's not on the map. And then when they finally got supervisors, they're like, yeah, New Zealand exists, but it's a state of Australia, so you can't have a New Zealand passport because it's not its own country. Ooh. You produce content around your travels, right? You've done fairly well considering you've only been doing it for like a year or something.
Well, not really. So I just started monetizing it like 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago.
Germany has monetization. Australia does not have a creator fund because they don't actually care. They just do it for optics and they don't care about the rest of us.
Well,
you'll take it.
Bad luck.
Because it's like your Afghan videos have done well. They got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views. And it's like, if you can keep doing that, it could fund future trips, especially considering how budget your trips are.
Exactly, that's kind of my goal. I've made 3 figures already.
For a broke student. You're not balling in LA, but it's a good amount
that
you weren't getting otherwise.
It's like a good pocket money, I would say. I could buy a new pair of sneakers for that.
What was it? The RPM was interesting though. Was it 22 euro cents per 1,000 views ish?
Yeah, kind of. So it depends on the video. So TikTok is kind of weird.
It's much lower than things like YouTube, but there's more videos you go through, so each ad is worth less.
Yeah, so I get paid per 1,000 views that are longer than 5 seconds. Problem is that the people also have to interact with your video. So, but when I go to place, you know, I have to inform myself. I have to actually spend time filming videos over and over again.
Yeah.
Because I usually like to take one takes because then they don't have these annoying cuts.
Yeah.
So I was in Kazakhstan. I was filming inside of a canyon, and then there were just like some random kids coming up to me, and that day it was clear that Madrid was gonna play Dortmund.
Okay, yeah.
They just came to me like, "Hala Madrid," while I was recording a video, and I was like,
"That's gonna be funny."
What the? Yeah, yes, it was funny, but I was like, "Yeah, I kind of have to record that whole thing," and I was nearly done.
Oh no.
So close, and then right at the end. I mean, sometimes it's really annoying because if there's like a strong wind, you can't hear shit. And if there are people just talking in the background, so sometimes I spend half an hour or an hour just recording one video.
Because it always looks very natural. It's like, oh, here's my first go. But
no, it's like my 20th go. But the more I record, the more I know what I'm gonna say. So sometimes I write a script to like kind of know what I'm talking about. But most of the time it's all freestyle. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember these facts. And look, I'm here. This stone is, I don't know, 20 million years old or whatever. I have no idea.
Because there's a number of people that, you know, trying to travel to every country.
Yeah.
But some countries you can't actually get into because either they're locked into a war or it's closed off, like North Korea. So what are your choices then?
First of all, it all depends on your nationality. Because, for example, some people from the Middle East, they can't, for example, go to Israel because they're banned. Or some people from, let's say, Somalia, they're like, they have a really tough time getting a visa for the US.
Yeah.
So there are these problems that people have to face. Luckily, I've got a German passport, which is a very, very strong one. It's ranked first in the world right now with 5 other nationalities, I think,
like
Dutch
Japan,
and
Singapore, but yeah.
So for most of the countries, I have to get an e-visa, which is quite easy to get in most of the cases. Sometimes
just really paying their money, basically.
Yeah, kind of, but it's a hassle to upload all the documents and whatever. It takes quite some time. But for some countries, we can just show up. Like Americans have a really tough time to go to Venezuela. We can just show up. But for a lot of countries like Mali, Niger, like a lot of African countries, you need to go to an embassy to get a visa.
That's annoying. And it's always the embassy in your home country as well. So if you're already traveling around, because I remember I was trying to look, like, could I get my British visa in Europe? And it was like, no, you have to be an Australian. And it's like, well, now I got to pay an extra $1,000 to expedite my already $3,700 visa. Just a miserable process, but much worse. Like, the amount of stories you hear from people who have less fortunate passports. Like, I think one of the biggest indicators of, like, career success is what passport you have. Because I was working on a theatre project.
Not necessarily, though.
Well, it dictates global geographical freedom, where you can go, how easy it is to travel.
Yes, but there have been travelers who have visited every country in the world on way...
but it's a lot more of a hassle and more expensive. And for example, my friend came back to Australia with his girlfriend. She had to apply for Australian visitor visa twice because they didn't believe she'd leave the country. Purely because she was Brazilian, even though...
Oh, she was from Brazil.
Yeah, but her family's in Brazil. She's studying in the US, and the Australian government was like, no. So then they had to go back with all of these signatures from a job, from a university, saying, no, she will return. Or, like a theatre project I worked on, this person had produced this beautiful autobiographical piece. And she was allowed in the US to study. Then she went home. She tried to visit a brother in Canada who was studying. Wasn't allowed in because they didn't think she'd leave. Then she tried to go back to the US for a wedding.
Yeah, that's a
wasn't allowed
problem.
in because they didn't think she'd leave. And the only place she could come in that circumstance was Australia. And then now she has to hang out in Australia for 7 years to get permanent residency before she can even go visit her family and friends in...
I still remember this one situation when I was talking to a friend in Uzbekistan. And I was asking her how easy it is for Central Asian people to travel. And she told me that if she wants to go to the US, there's a chance of 93% of her being rejected. So only 7% of all Uzbeks that apply for a US visa actually get the US visa.
And yet we can just pay $20 and we're in.
Exactly.
Assuming we don't carry... things like I heard of someone being turned around at the border because they had a newspaper that wasn't friendly to the US in their hand. It's like, don't, as long as you don't do that, you should be fine.
Or don't carry anything illegal.
No,
in general,
they'll find any excuse.
Don't do drugs, kid. I've never done drugs in my life, so
I've done Panadol. Let's go.
What's that?
Paracetamol.
Oh yeah,
Nurofen type. That's how lit my nights get. So for people who, once again, are potentially also on severe budgets or maybe have passports that are much more limiting than a German or a Singaporean or a Japanese, how can they go about, taking all of these adventures that you have been able to go on despite these limitations?
Well, I mean, an adventure is never really limited to any place, so you can pretty much have the same adventure in every country. So there are beautiful websites that state which nationality can visit which country, visa free, need to get a visa for which country, whatever. So I would just have a look at these websites and just don't go to the expensive places first. So I've done quite some expensive countries and they've really ruined my bank account. Iceland was insane. I'm telling you, $30 for a pizza. Wow.
30 euros?
Yeah, 30 euros. Sorry. The underrated ones I would say are Balkan in Europe.
I've heard a lot of that.
Or Eastern Europe in general. Even European Union members like Poland. They're still kind of affordable.
Much more than Netherlands, Germany, Paris.
The Middle East is kind of affordable, but depends on where you go. So don't start in Dubai or Kuwait. That's expensive. But go to
start in
Turkey,
Israel and the West Bank. You got there just in time.
I would leave that for a while.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah, Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, these places are generally cheap. Like
everyone does the Thailand,
Laos, Vietnam. I once paid €1.20 for satay chicken in Indonesia. That's
Sounds
crazy.
good.
Like for an entire plate.
And imagine like the sort of the point of you've paid $1 for this meal, and then you're filming a bit about, look, I just paid $1 for this meal, and that video makes, I don't know, let's say hypothetically $30. Like it's an odd concept.
So you make up for parts of the trip.
The only way I've really been able to afford to do the travel that I have is staying on couches. Like I can't afford Amsterdam, I can't afford Germany, I can't afford New York where I'm going, or
I've slept in airports, I've slept on benches somewhere in a park, whatever.
Yeah.
Just to not waste any money on that.
Because
accommodation is usually expensive.
Yeah.
Depending on the place. Some countries have really cheap accommodation. Like I still remember that one place in Yerevan in Armenia. I stayed at a hostel, like really, really, really nice. Like better than Europe.
Yeah. Oh wow.
Like it was insanely good. They had everything. It was nine euros a night. So it just really depends on where you go.
Yeah.
Of course, I've had crappy apartments. Like that's unavoidable.
Southern Africa in the biggest heat wave they've had in recorded history, and you were doing couch surfing in a tiny room with no aircon. I was
in Zambia
in pain, and we had aircon.
It was awful.
Because we just missed each other by like a week.
You know, we were
Zambia. Zambia.
So I was there with one of my best friends, and so we were just texting some random people on couch surfing. This one guy, Ruben, super good, nice dude, and he said, "Yeah, that's gonna be a room, big bed, everything, no aircon, nothing." And on that day,
this was daily, like 43 degrees.
Yeah, it was like 40-ish on that day. I was dying at night. So we got undressed until our underwear. And we had to sleep we had to sleep next to each other. And what you have to consider is that I'm built quite wide, and my friend is 2 meters and 1. So he's quite wide as well. So he was just taking up so much space in length, and I was just taking so much space in width. Yeah. So that was it was kind of cuddly. Let's say at 40 degrees, and I at first I didn't want to sleep without my clothes because I wanted to have as much protection against mosquitoes as possible. Point. Yeah, but I was just showering in mosquito repellent.
Well, it was so hot, I was waterboarding myself to stay cool. Like, we would soak a cloth, and you're in the car, and you just have this over your face to get any sort of fresh air. Phones were overheating after 20 seconds of use.
He ran out of water, so because the village had no water left. Yeah, there's some countries where you have shortages of just anything.
South Africa. Where 10 hours a day, there's no electricity.
Yeah, it's awful.
But luckily, if you're in certain areas, if it's the rich touristy areas, they all have generators anyway. But if you're not in those spots...
Or Zimbabwe, just running out of cash.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a crazy thing as well. You gotta bring enough US dollars, which are painful to spend.
So, one of my travel advices for you, if you ever go to a country which is not like the usual card-friendly country, take enough cash with you. Because if you run out of cash, if you run out of money, if they block your credit card, you're screwed. I was in Tajikistan, and I was so convinced that Tajikistan would take card. And yes, in restaurants they did, most of the restaurants, most of the cafes, whatever. We wanted to withdraw cash from an ATM in Dushanbe, the capital city. And you would assume, oh yeah, the capital city, that should work. Our cards were denied in 30 ATMs all over the city. I was writing in a travel group that I have on Facebook. That's also a big travel hack. Most likely find an answer because some other idiot had the exact same problem a while ago. And there was this one ATM that was recommended. We went there. We were praying. Like, we were like, please, please, please. And then it actually gave us cash, and we were like,
that's lucky.
Yeah. Because otherwise we couldn't have paid for our hotel. Oops. And we couldn't have gone back to Uzbekistan afterwards.
You're trapped.
We had yes, exactly. I've talked to a lot of border guards in my life, and there's some to joke around with, like especially countries that don't receive a lot of visitors. They're just happy to have someone there. Like in Afghanistan, they were like, "Oh yeah, nice to meet you."
The first person in 3 days.
Now Afghanistan receives like 7,000 tourists a year. So that's crazy. That's like New York in 1 minute.
I remember at Malaysia, there was some guy, he was some supposedly famous soccer player sitting in front of me because I overheard him talk about some teams or whatever. And then we finally get to security. all the border guards stop. They whip out their soccer balls and run to this guy saying, please sign it, oh my god. And then you just start getting this crowd swarm around him.
Wow,
I was like,
that's crazy, yeah.
that's a border security that doesn't have to stress about much.
Oh, yeah.
They're just having a good time.
Well, Malaysians, they're really cheerful anyways.
So what country are you up to now?
I've visited 88 countries. So, well, it depends on which amount of countries you count for yourself.
Whether you count Scotland, or whether you count Palestine, or whether you count Hong Kong, or whether you count
Vatican.
Vatican.
Yeah, kind of. There are people that usually count the 193 member states of the United Nations. But then, as well, there's Vatican City, which is not a member of the United Nations due to neutrality purposes, but it's a country. So it's 194. But then technically you could also add countries that are just partially recognized, like Kosovo or Palestine or Taiwan. Exactly. So this is what
it's a country. It's
this
just
is
trying
what
to get
this is what I count. I count 197.
Yeah.
So I include all UN member states.
Yeah.
I include Vatican City, Palestine, Taiwan.
Yeah.
And Kosovo, so that's 197.
That's like the bigger number is like 206.
Yeah, there are some people, like there's some areas in the world that are kind of like disputed, like Western Sahara, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, stuff like that. So they're like, yeah, that's totally a country for me. That, or the people that don't see the UK as one country, they go like, oh, it's England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland.
They got separate parliaments.
So depending on which number of countries you actually choose for yourself, then this is the goal that you're going for. And
so where can people follow your journey in the following 100 odd countries that you still got to visit?
I still got 109 countries left.
And you've already done 80 odd.
I've got Instagram and TikTok.
Yeah.
It's the same name. It's Jannis Travels.
Very easy to spell. That's handy.
I've really had the opportunity to experience so many things around the world. Crazy stories, like hitchhiking in Iraq or whatever. So crazy stories. If you're interested in traveling, if you're interested in seeing like off the beaten path,
what it's like to hitchhike in Iraq,
I want to show people the real country that I'm visiting, not the media portrait, whatever.
What is it like actually on the ground?
Exactly.
Not what you just hear through the press.
Exactly, because media often portrays a country as like let's take
it's news items. It's like
Russia, for example. Yeah. Western media portrays Russia as a really, really, really bad country, but once you're there, you just realize it's just normal.
The US has been at war for decades, and yet what it's doing overseas isn't necessarily a reflection of its internal living standards. So it'd be the same with Russia while they're doing stuff.
Well, yeah, there are some areas of Russia, the border areas with Ukraine, that you want to avoid. But if you go to Moscow, St. Petersburg, Siberia, whatever, then these areas are just fine. They're just like any other country.
Yeah.
And actually, I really liked Russia. It's really clean, really organized, cheap as well.
Architecture looked phenomenal.
Wow, I gotta say, St. Petersburg is insane. It's one of my favorite cities in the world, and wow.
And perfect. We got to get some Mexican or Italian?
Mexican.
Phenomenal. Sounds good.
Yeah. Let's go.
Woo.